Good morning. This lecture covers two great ensembles, a chapel and an altarpiece, which could not possibly present a greater contrast. They were painted in different countries, but astonishingly within the same decade. First, Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, then Grünewald's Isenheim altar. We were looking at a view of the Sistine Chapel. It is a vast chapel, 128 feet long, 45 feet wide, completed by 1481 and decorated soon afterwards with a band of narrative frescoes on its walls beginning just below the windows. And that is all there was, except for a vault painted blue with gold stars, until the arrival of Michelangelo in 1508 with the unexpected commission to repaint the vault, the ceiling, with a new and elaborate cycle of narrative paintings on biblical themes. To condense Michelangelo, born in 1475 in Caprese in Tuscany, and therefore his achievement, into a single sentence would be like condensing the history of European art and much of world art since 1500. I tried a sentence. One of history's greatest and most famous artists, he was a sculptor, architect, painter, and poet, whose work was so overpowering in its effect that his influence was inescapable during his lifetime and has never ceased. Now that's hopelessly inadequate. Words fail me. So I summon one of the world's great writers, Goethe, to speak for the Sistine ceiling. No one who has not seen the Sistine Chapel can have a clear idea of what a human being can achieve. His greatness is beyond all description. And now our attention to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel will be condensed into a glance at the whole and a few minutes with two selected subjects from the vast project. Those subjects, are among the greatest images in the world and help to make the ceiling as a whole one of the greatest works in the world. As you know, the Sistine is the private chapel of the Pope and is one of the most sacred places in the Vatican. It is also one of the most public tourist attractions in the world. The commission was unexpected because Michelangelo, who always considered himself primarily a sculptor, was prepared to begin work on the tomb of the Pope, Julius II, who abruptly ordered him to decorate the ceiling first. The tomb could wait. Although certainly familiar with the medium, Michelangelo had never completed a fresco of his own. The Sistine ceiling, decorated between 1508 and 1511, painted in fresco, 128 feet long, 45 feet wide. That's 39 by 13.7 meters in the Vatican. This decoration consists of a sequence of scenes on the ceiling from the altar toward the main entrance. From the book of Genesis, scenes of creation through the expulsion from Eden, and scenes from life of Noah, while on the coved or concave sides, prophets alternate with sibyls, and in the triangular spandrels and lunettes above the windows, the ancestors of Christ. Let me locate one of the creation scenes, the most famous, for you. This is its position on the ceiling. Go forth from the bottom and you will arrive at it. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're actually moving from the altar toward the door, and it's the fourth one from the altar from the bottom, and of course it is the creation of Adam. It is simply one of the most iconic paintings in the world. There is no more familiar, no more frequently reproduced painting in the world. Even the Mona Lisa is a runner-up in that particular contest. The creation of Adam has been admired and it has been parodied, a sure sign of iconic status. It is and has been for centuries so much a part of our mental furniture that it's very difficult to see it freshly. Any painting that has become part of our permanent visual memory must have more than publicity going for it. It must have formal qualities, artistic qualities that have allowed it to drill into our eyes and brains. So let's look at it, to see it, to realize consciously understand what we see. You may find that you do not correctly remember certain things about it, or that you didn't really see them before. All of us could say the same. So, what do we see in the creation of Adam? Well, perhaps the first thing we see is a symmetrical composition, but unusual, since we tend to expect a large central focus. Here are two large forms flanking a mostly open center. Please ponder that while we continue. God the Father, supported by angels and surrounded by a great cloak, enters energetically from the right. When I say energetically, I do not mean under his own power or propelled by the angels, but the force of wind is seen in the drapery and in his hair, indicating rapid movement, and the elongated oval area that he occupies increases the appearance of movement. He extends his right arm out of the oval, and the long forefinger of his hand nears another hand. The second form is that of Adam, lying upon a barren earth, no Garden of Eden here yet. His body completely within the contour of the sloping ground, except for his left forearm with his drooping hand and forefinger. There is no energy here, only lassitude, not being, only becoming. Look at the whole body of Adam, the long, long line of his leg and torso, still bound to earth. His torso barely supported by his right arm, which has no apparent strength. His head does have the spark of life, and his gaze is locked with God's. And that force, the gaze, seems to pull his head forward from his torpid body. His left arm has to be supported by the prop of his knee, his leg bent tightly into a vertical wedge. And his hand, as we already noticed, hardly sustains itself. Like God's arm, Adam's extends outward from his earthbound slope, drawn by the force of creation, God. Now, that emptiness in the center of this symmetrical painting is, of course, a powerful invention, because our eyes look naturally to the center, and because Michelangelo has flanked it with two forces of convergence. The center holds. It is not empty. Two small forms, two hands converge, and that is what we see first. That famous gap between God's fingertip and Adam's is very short, yet clearly readable from the floor of the chapel, trust me. Less because we see the space than because we see the difference in the fingers. In speaking of this passage, we habitually speak of a spark of life passing from God to man. Well, that may be an over-literal imagination aided by the cracks in the plaster, or it may not be, because it also seems possible to follow, to trace the life force as it moves from God's directed, operative fingertip, his other fingers relax, as it enters Adam's hand and passes through his arm to his head. Although his face is expressionless, the head is pulled forward involuntarily with stirring life, and eyes which already seem to be quickening with awareness. And it is possible to imagine, without being fanciful, that inert lower body with its long passive line, receiving that energy from shoulder to toe and flexing its muscles as it feels the ability to move for the first time, to live. May I return to the two figures once more? The unified form of God and angels and the drapery is a closed form with all lines directed to one point, his right forefinger. Adam's is a closed form on the left, where it is one with the earth from which it is created. God formed man of the dust of the ground is the gospel, and open on the right, facing God and life. Otherwise, they're remarkably similar, indeed parallel. The two bodies are placed in similarly sloping diagonals. The two hands are almost like mirror images, except for the creative force in one. And the heads, gazing at one another so intently, are, aside from a beard, very close indeed. Look at the design of the eyes, of their ears, of the nose, the forehead, the swept back hair. They look, do they not, like father and son? So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Despite the permanence that the creation of Adam has in our culture, we must realize that it was not instantly famous, for the good reason that nothing really like it had ever been seen before. In art, God was always shown standing next to the newly created Adam. Or in a remarkable 13th century mosaic in San Marco in Venice, God, is seated and literally modeling Adam out of the dust of the ground like a sculptor. So, it's not surprising that a learned contemporary who saw this for the first time, saw in Michelangelo's new creation only an old man flying through the air, not recognizing him as God and not mentioning Adam in his account. Michelangelo's Adam has long since replaced all the others in our mind's eye. As Goethe also wrote, if there were only some means of fixing such pictures in one's soul. The prophets and sibyls that were painted by Michelangelo along the coved sides of the ceiling are powerfully inventive and expressive figures and are among the most famous of the great Sistine figures. On the south side, nearest the altar, is the lamenting Jeremiah. None of the prophets that Michelangelo invented are more poignant, indeed more ominous, than Jeremiah. He is posed frontally, but Michelangelo drops one side of Jeremiah's body into shadow, and his face is averted into shadow. His massive figure is heavily draped in yellow, gold, and rose robes. Unlike most of the other prophets and sibyls, he holds no book or scroll of his prophecies. His body is his sole attribute, as it were. Of all these figures, only his is utterly inactive. No gesture, no movement, not even reading. Instead, he is thinking, and the powerful design turns inward. In the memorable words of one scholar, this slow-breathing, meditating monolith embodies the concept of thought itself. But what thought weighs on this profound prophet? The rounded bulk of this body, the heaviness of the clothes, the lifeless fall of his beard and his left hand, the sheer white garment beneath the laprobe, all pull downward. He is the absolute expression of weight, physical weight, that embodies an emotion. His entire body droops under this freight, and his feet, crossed at the ankles, cannot visually support such weight, and so there's a sinking sensation that can be felt as depression. Well, that's what we see, but what does it portend? He is the ominous prophet who wrote that oppression and suffering must precede salvation. His words were usually read as a lamentation on the destruction of Jerusalem. For this the earth shall mourn, and the heavens above be black. Let mine eyes run down with tears night and day, and let them not cease. Jeremiah looks downward. He sits above and looks directly down upon the papal throne, and his profound depression and sorrow are transferred there. The Pope, like the prophet, carries the weight of his sorrow alone. That is Michelangelo's message in placing Jeremiah above Julius II. And contemporary Italian and papal history gave the pairing of prophet and pope special relevance. The papal troops were engaged in the continuing attempt to drive the French from Italy. Thus words from Jeremiah such as these: "Thou hast heard, O my soul, the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Destruction upon destruction is cried, for the whole land is spoiled." Such words had sharp point. These two wonderful images within the great painted complex of the Sistine ceiling may honorably represent Michelangelo's achievement, and yet not hint at the magnificence and significance of the whole. I trust that you will continue what we have begun together. Matthias Grünewald, our second painter. As I said at the top of this lecture, there could be no greater contrast than between Michelangelo Buonarroti and Matthias Grünewald. This is not just a matter of two different cultures in Italy and Germany, since Grünewald's art is also a complete contrast with the art of Albrecht Dürer, German, albeit from a different region. No, this is not just about North and South or the Nordic and Mediterranean temperaments. It is about two individual artists and their greatest paintings. One was imbued with Renaissance humanism, infused with and magnified by a heroic, epic spirit. The other was inspired by mysticism, born in the Middle Ages but still vibrantly alive, which embraced the extremes of physical suffering and transcendent ecstasy. Both artists worked for the Church, the still unified Catholic Church, but just on the cusp of conflict and reformation. There is uncertainty about the life of the artist we call Matthias Grünewald, including his proper name. Grünewald, also known sometimes in the literature as Neidhart or Master Matthis, may have been born about the same time as his great contemporary, Albrecht Dürer, and they died in the same year, 1528. What is not in doubt is his greatest achievement, the altar from Eisenheim, dated 1515. By acclamation, it is one of the towering masterpieces of German art. It was painted in the region of Alsace, near the Rhine, and remains there, though not in its original place. It was painted for a hospital belonging to a religious community dedicated to St. Anthony and possessing some of his relics. Eisenheim is about 12.5 miles, 20 kilometers from Colmar, and it was to that town, Colmar, then and now part of France, that the altarpiece was moved in 1793 at the time of the French Revolution, and it has been in the museum there since its founding in 1852. That museum was adapted from a former Dominican convent, and the altarpiece was appropriately installed in its 13th century chapel. However, it has never been displayed there as it must have been at Eisenheim. When it was taken from Eisenheim in the late 18th century, the panels and sculptures were removed from the heavy superstructure and framing pieces. A new framework was made in 1930. The panels were mounted separately so that all paintings are permanently visible. That is, it's no longer an altarpiece with hinged sections that can be opened sequentially like a book. Here is a reconstruction of the altarpiece as it would have been seen in its original state. It had two sets of wings displaying three different views. Stage one shows the crucifixion in the center, with St. Anthony on the left and St. Sebastian on the right. The predella below contains the Lamentation of Christ. Stage one opens from the middle to reveal stage two, which shows in the center the Concert of Angels and the Madonna and Child. On the left is the Annunciation, and on the right is the Resurrection. The predella remains the same in this second view. In this third and final stage, we see on the left the meeting of Anthony and Paul. On the right, the temptation of St. Anthony. In the center, and the predella, a large sculpture group done by a different artist. This is the central panel from the front or first stage of the altarpiece. Look closely, if you can, at the tormented, distended body on the cross. The width of the crossbar, dragged down by the weight it bears, the length of his arms, their contours, the spasmodic hands, fingers stretching into the black night, the fallen head, the rib cage pushing through the taut skin, and so on down to the indescribable feet. One foot really on top of the other, violated by a single nail, and the whole body discolored and disfigured by wounds from the flogging, details which Italian artists would limit out of respect for the human body. Looking at the body of Christ, many people react with revulsion, and some wonder why Grünewald had to be so graphic in his depiction, not only of the distorted form of the body, but perhaps especially the tortured and discolored flesh. So we need to know an essential fact. The hospital in the convent at Eisenheim was specifically for patients suffering from ergotism, a devastating, non-contagious disease documented in the Rhine Valley as early as the 9th century and recurring regularly, including a Europe-wide outbreak around 1500. Its cause was unknown for centuries, but it is a disease caused by ergot or rye fungus. Since rye was a staple crop of the poor, they were afflicted in large numbers. From the 11th century, the Brothers of St. Anthony established hundreds of hospitals at their convents and devoted themselves to the treatment of this mysterious disease, perhaps because their 4th century founder, St. Anthony, had been physically tormented by demons in a vision. Thus, the Antonite brothers became particularly associated with the treatment of ergotism. Indeed, it was soon named St. Anthony's fire, the fire referring to the burning pain. There are two types of ergotism, convulsive and gangrenous. The former attacked the nervous system, producing physical contortions and shaking and spasms, as well as delusions and hallucinations. The latter caused gangrene by constricting blood flow in the extremities, which also produced severe pain. And of course, fingers and toes and even arms and legs could be lost to the infection. Clearly, it was gruesome. That is sufficient reason for the exaggerated disfiguring wounds and sores and the flesh color of the dead Christ here. At first glance, this looks like a narrative scene, but it is not. It does not tell a story. It is a signifier of the core meaning of the Christian event, the horrible suffering and death of Jesus for the sake of others. It is not a narrative scene because Christ is proportionately larger than the other figures. Therefore, his suffering is painfully exaggerated. The realistic details of his body are not symbolic, they are expressionistic. The figures do not interact as in a narrative. Mary and John lean sharply away from the cross, separate from, not looking at the cross. The kneeling Mary Magdalene plays out her grief unnoticed by others, her interlaced, outstretched fingers, a small echo of the hands of Christ. She alone looks up at him, and his head inclines toward her, but her eyes are closed. Most especially, this is not a narrative scene because of the figure of St. John the Baptist, who was not present at the crucifixion, was not alive. He was the messenger or forerunner of Christ who prophesied his advent, and in Grünewald's image, he points to the body of Christ with a long forefinger. How many expressive fingers are here in this painting? And his prophecy, as recorded in the Gospel of John the Evangelist, is painted in Latin between his mouth and his hand. He must increase, but I must decrease. But that was spoken before John baptized Jesus, so there's a startling mystery here. The Baptist was martyred after preparing the way for Jesus, but here he lives again while Christ is dead on the cross. The Baptist's old words must now predict the resurrection. In contrast to the tortured body and the extreme emotions of those to the left of the cross, the Baptist is impassive. He's not an actor in the scene. He is resolutely there to confirm, to ratify the significance of the sacrifice. The Baptist had also said, when Jesus first approached him, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." Grünewald paints the symbolic lamb from John's feet, looking up, holding a reed cross and bleeding into a chalice. Symbol of sacrifice, symbol of the Mass. Here is the Eisenheim altarpiece, first stage completely open. This is painted in oil on panel, if I did not say so. In the museum today, I want to point out that Saints Sebastian and Anthony are on the wrong sides if you go to the museum. We've corrected that because we don't have to worry about what's painted on the other side. So photographically, we will have Saint Anthony on the left and Saint Sebastian on the right, as they originally were. The body of Christ in the predella is also disfigured by sores and scourge marks, just as the body on the cross is. We haven't looked at an altarpiece of this type before, with panels that can be opened to reveal other scenes. There are 3 stages in the Eisenheim altarpiece. This is the first. I will show you 2 of the 3 images from the second, but none from the third stage, which is dominated by a large sculpture group by another artist. Today, all of these paintings are not together but are shown separately. One doesn't open the altarpiece anymore, but originally if you opened it from the center outward, you would have had an even wider picture that included an Annunciation on the left, a Resurrection on the right, and in the center, this scene of the concert of the angels and Madonna and Child. Now, this scene is as wide as the crucifixion panel, which it was beneath. And it is 2 scenes in one, since actually the angels are serenading the Madonna and Child. They belong together in that sense. But the scenes are very different, with the Holy Family set on a terrace in front of a dramatic landscape, while most of the angels are underneath an elaborate Gothic canopy. Before I leave that landscape with the Madonna, can I point out the glory in the sky, because I want to refer to it later. At the very top of that glory, in which there are many angels, God the Father is at the very top, and I'll be referring to him later. The Madonna is very large. Do you realize that if she were standing, she would be as large as the Christ of the crucifixion? I want to concentrate on the gorgeous but mysterious concert of angels on the left. This is the second painting in which we've seen musical angels, although these are much larger and fewer than Gertgen's miraculous creatures in his Madonna with musical angels. In front of this musical group is the largest angel with a bass viol. Next is the viol or viol playing angel under the canopy behind her hymn. Strangest of all is the blue-gray figure at the far left under the canopy, also playing a large viol. I have always thought that he must be the devil in disguise, and in fact he surely is Lucifer, the fallen angel. But looking closely at his demeanor, one must be struck by the fact that he looks upward at God, all the way in that other part of the central panel above the Madonna. He looks upward at God, the Father, not as others do at the Madonna and Child, who they're serenading. And his expression is one of adoration. Even Lucifer must pay homage in this painting. The myriad other angelic beings glimpsed in the dark interior all seem to be singing. The greatest mystery in this painting is the woman bathed in a brilliantly glowing aureole with angels dancing above her head. Do you see her just to the right of the central pillar? I think it must be thought of as a mystical vision, somehow linking the angelic half of the picture with the Madonna. And I also think that it's probably connected with specific mystical writings yet to be identified. And in this context, it's important that the convent at Unterlinden was one of the chief centers of religious mystical life and thought, which first arose in the Rhine Valley in the late Middle Ages with such famous names as Meister Eckhart and Hildegard of Bingen, a writer, a mystic, and composer herself. At the far right of this second stage of the open altarpiece is the utterly astonishing resurrection. Christ rises from the tomb, seemingly drawn upward by the flaming halo that encircles his head and arms. That brilliant halo in the night sky illuminates the lower part of the scene, the Roman soldiers tossed about like toys, the open tomb, the blue-white winding sheet that trails him like a jet stream. But the movement is all below. It is stopped completely when that radiance is reached. This is a sun, reminiscent of the halo in Gertken's tiny painting, and it seems to the modern viewer to anticipate some of Van Gogh's astounding, huge suns. But more to the point, we know that the early Christians borrowed the Roman sun god Apollo as a cryptic surrogate for Christ, and that enduring union, Christ-Apollo, remains implicit in this sun-like explosion of his resurrection. In the last picture of the altarpiece, Grünewald inscribes a plea. "Where were you, good Jesus? Where were you? Why did you not come to heal my wounds?" This was the prayer of all the sufferers in the hospital at Eisenheim, and the painting was the artist's astounding attempt to answer it. This is Grünewald's masterpiece, whose beauty and emotion may leave you filled with hope or despair, but you will not forget it.